Please pray with me. Gracious God, may the meditations of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be a pleasing offering to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. This morning we celebrate with bated breath the fourth Sunday of Advent. We are still expecting, we are still patient, we are still waiting. Excuse me. But because Christmas is Monday this year, this very evening is Christmas Eve. And the waiting is pretty much over and the celebrating begins. Oh, and I have to write and deliver 2 sermons on the same day. Would people object if I dialed it in and we watched a movie for Christmas Eve instead? Texts like the one from Luke are so well known to us. It's hard for us to be challenged by these readings because we think we know everything about them. And it's also hard to hear them as the shocking things that they really are, because they are so familiar to us. Even as I was reading my commentaries on the text for this sermon, I realized there's a few things about it that I didn't know. You know, I read a commentary that happened to mention something, and I was like, oh wow, I never noticed that. The text from 2 Samuel 7 serves as the most important expression of God's eternal covenant with David and David's descendants. David offers to build God a house, and that's the word that's used here for the temple. But instead, God promises to build David a house. And by that, God is referring to a dynasty. Sometimes I think the Hebrew writers were just all dads because of their puns are like bad dad jokes. But this passage serves as the base for pretty much all messianic hopes for the Jewish people. After Jerusalem and the temple are first destroyed in 587 BCE by the Babylonians. And it also played a big role in the formation of Christianity and our understanding of the identity of Jesus. Can we hear how shocking that message is? God has made an unbreakable, eternal covenant with David and David's heirs that their throne would last forever. Yet in Jesus' time, though the temple and Jerusalem had been rebuilt, a descendant of David hadn't sat on the throne in Jerusalem for 600 years. Think about that. God promises that his kingdom will never end, that a descendant of his will always be on the throne, and yet for the last 600 years, no son of David was on the throne at all. You'd be forgiven for thinking that God must have changed God's mind, since David's kingdom is nowhere to be seen and hasn't been for 6 centuries. Our next reading is a doxology, which is a short statement. This is the one in Romans. It's a short statement of praise to God. It reminds us that the gospel is a mystery, largely hidden from the world, and only revealed bit by bit through Jesus Christ. It might seem just a little baby, like just a little baby born on the margins of society, but that little baby is the power of God breaking into our world. From little Bethlehem, the light breaks forth throughout the whole world. And the most proper response for us is awe at what God is doing, followed by faith and obedience. But imagine how shocking that message must have seemed to many at the time. Christianity was a tiny minority in a large empire that at best was indifferent and at worst was openly hostile to them. And Jesus Christ was supposed to return soon. But even now, 2,000 years later, he still hasn't come back. So where is the power of God? What's going on? This message seems shocking to us. Now, the gospel reading is, of course, the familiar story of the Annunciation, where the angel Gabriel tells Mary that she's going to have a child. At this point, our Advent readings have pivoted from expectation to the first part of the birth narrative, the Christmas story. So if I wanted to make a stink about commercialism of Christmas in the U.S. today, it's too late, because the angel of Gabriel has let the cat out of the bag. Sorry. But despite the compelling characters in this reading, God is the real agent, the real actor here. It is God's grace, it is God's power that moves the story forward. Abraham and Sarah miraculously bear Isaac in their old age. Zachariah and Elizabeth miraculously bear John the Baptizer. And Mary will miraculously bear Jesus, the ultimate gift to this hurting world. For nothing will be impossible with God. Again, a shocking message. A young, engaged woman, still a virgin, is going to give birth to the Son of God. Now, virgin births were common in the mythologies of the ancient world, but not in the Jewish tradition. This was something new, something shocking. And the title Son of God is shocking because this was a title in the Hebrew Bible normally used for the anointed king. It's a royal title. Plus, Son of God was a title that Caesar used for himself. So through this peasant baby born in a provincial backwater, God is putting the mighty emperor himself on notice that his days are numbered. Shocking. Despite our familiarity with these stories, they still are shocking. They remain so because God's promise to David and his family seems even more unlikely because you have to add another 2,000 years to the 600 that was already there in Jesus' time. Where is David's kingdom? The return of Jesus Christ seems even more unlikely because we're still waiting. And the idea that a little baby born in poverty in an insignificant place could somehow supplant the most powerful of this world still sounds a bit unlikely. God's message of salvation still seems incredible to so many people in this world. What are we to do with this shocking message that seems so very unlikely? From the Hebrew Bible, we know that God's salvation has been in the works for a long time. We learn that God's promises take time, but that they can always be counted on. And from our gospel reading, we learn that God intends to turn our world upside down by replacing our human systems with God's system. And from Romans, we learn that our proper response to this shocking grace is praise and faith and obedience. These old stories are truly familiar to us. And that's why we shouldn't let their shocking nature escape us. Because God's grace is so beyond our comprehension, it should always shock us. There's a reason why in the old days they talked about the scandal of grace. Because God was always doing things that we didn't think God should do. God was always opening doors for people that we didn't think should have doors opened for them. I remember seeing a Facebook meme once that I thought really encapsulated the Christian message in a really good way, but it also shows the shocking and disturbing nature of it. The real test of forgiveness, the real test of God's grace, is not forgiving Peter for his denying Jesus. The real test of grace and forgiveness is forgiving Judas. That is shocking. And that is something we struggle with. How do we come to to terms with such a radical forgiveness, a radical grace that blows off all of our limitations, that operates on a level we cannot comprehend. God's grace is beyond our comprehension, and it is shocking. But despite how much time has elapsed, God's promises still stand. God's intention is to establish God's kingdom where justice and righteousness and peace predominate. And in that kingdom, all things are governed by love. So as we come into this time of Christmas, as we turn from Advent to Christmas, may we allow this grace to shock us and wake us up and realize that this is just not yet another day. This is not just another holiday. This is a day that marks a radical change in the history of humanity, because God has turned everything upside down. God has opened the doors in ways that we never thought God would. And God's grace is at work in this world, changing everything for the good.